The crown looked heavy, but no one ever said it was cursed. Tonight, we're peeling back the gold leaf mask of Egypt's most powerful figures. Not the gods in human form, but the frightened boys behind the symbols. The ones who were never allowed to be children. The ones who were expected to live forever and terrified they wouldn't. From cradle to coffin, their lives were less about ruling and more about surviving. Let's begin. Before they could crawl, they were worshipped. The moment a child was declared heir to the throne of Egypt, the world changed around them. It wasn't joy that filled the air. It was dread. Because birthing a future pharaoh wasn't seen as creating life. It was summoning divinity. That meant rituals. That meant omens. That meant power, political, cosmic, and dangerous. The mother's body became a national relic. The baby, a state secret. Every cough the infant made sparked priestly debate. Each star in the sky on their birth night was read as prophecy. If a comet passed overhead, it was written into temple scrolls as a sign, either of war or of divine blessing. There was no room for normalcy. There was no just a baby. Because if you were born into the house of Horus, you weren't allowed to be human. You were property of the gods. The naming ceremony was never about the child. It was about legacy. Would they be beloved of Ra? Would they be strong like Horus? The names had to echo power, but power came with expectations, ones that crushed most before their first steps. They were wrapped in linen, not just for warmth, but to be symbolically linked to Osiris, the god of death. From the very beginning, death and rule walked hand in hand. You might picture celebration, music, dancing. There was some, but not for joy. It was for appeasement, to calm the forces that watched, to prevent bad omens from seeping in. Wet nurses were vetted by priests. Astrologers inspected the mother's dreams. The child was anointed with oils, blessed with chants, then hidden. Hidden from jealous cousins, hidden from political enemies, hidden from curses. Born a god, but born already at risk. Even the walls of the palace seemed to whisper. Before the baby could speak, their name was etched into stone. Not as a child, as a future king. Their cries weren't answered with lullabies. They were answered with priests scribbling interpretations. Is he crying because the gods are angry? Is he warning us of a future famine? It was exhausting, and he couldn't even hold his own head up yet. All the while, the mother's role shrank. She had done her duty. Now she was just a symbol, too. A holy womb, not a parent. She wasn't trusted to raise him. That was the job of caretakers with strict rules. The baby would be bathed in sacred waters, spoken to only in ritual language, every movement recorded. A life fully documented and fully disconnected from love. No one dared call him cute. To do so would be to forget he was divine. When he sneezed, it was called a message. When he blinked, it was interpreted. And all the while, inside this tiny body was just a child, no different than any other baby, except everyone around him believed he was something else entirely. He would never get to be curious. He would only get to be correct. Outside the palace, people sang praises. Inside, silence. The kind of silence where fear lives. The kind of silence that comes from walking on eggshells made of prophecy. The baby would be handed carved toys of sacred animals, not to play, but to train. Training began before walking, before speech, before joy. Because a pharaoh's joy didn't matter. His destiny was too loud to hear his laughter. The irony was this. Egypt needed their pharaohs to be gods, but they needed them to be obedient gods. No real power, just the appearance of it. And so, from the first breath, the child was molded by religion, by fear, by legacy. He was wrapped in silk, carried in gold, surrounded by incense. But not because he was loved, because he was useful. The royal birth wasn't a beginning. It was a sacrifice. He could walk, but only along sacred paths. He could talk, but only in rehearsed lines. The childhood of a pharaoh wasn't about learning. It was about conditioning. Everything was ritual. Waking up, timed to celestial patterns, bathing, supervised by priests, even eating had its own hymn. From the outside, it seemed divine, but from within, it was a schedule designed by fear, enforced by silence, and softened by nothing. No toys, no stories, only symbols. A wooden hawk to remind him he was Horus. A mirror, shaped like the sun disk, to remind him Ra was always watching. The lessons began before he understood the words. How to sit, how to bow, how to fake serenity. Laughter was suspicious. Tears were political. Even boredom was dangerous, because it suggested the divine child was ungrateful for the sacred path. His caretakers weren't parents. They were actors in a long-running play. Some whispered words of comfort when no one watched. Others remained silent for fear of punishment. Every adult around him bowed, smiled, and lied. He was praised for being perfect, but he knew it wasn't real. No one hugged him without a reason. No one looked him in the eyes for too long. It was lonely, even in a crowd. He learned to speak in metaphors. Not because he was poetic, but because he had to. Literal speech was too dangerous. A simple, "I'm tired," could become, "The gods are displeased." A yawn, seen as an omen. So he learned silence. Not peace, not meditation, just the kind of silence that grows roots inside a child and wraps around their ability to be seen as human. And no one noticed, because no one wanted to. The windows in the palace were narrow, not just for defense, but to limit what the child could see. The outside world was a rumor. He'd hear the cries of the market, the songs of the fishermen, the bleats of goats. But he could only imagine what they looked like. His world was stone, gold, and endless corridors. He knew more about gods than people, more about judgment than joy. And that was by design. When other children played in the dust, he walked marble floors barefoot. But they weren't warm. They were cold, polished and slick, like the image he was forced to become. He was not to stumble. He was not to bruise. His body was the state's sculpture, kept pristine, but not protected, because protection would require love. And the court didn't love pharaohs. They tolerated them, trained them, feared them, and ultimately used them. Lessons were constant, not about math or stars, though he learned those too, but lessons in posture, in perception, in performing divinity. He was told what to wear, what to say, how to look both gentle and powerful. He had to sit for hours in silence while priests described his greatness to others, while he listened, still unsure what any of it meant. He learned one thing above all. Never look confused. He wasn't alone exactly. There were other royal children, half-siblings, cousins, political guests. But friendship was impossible. Any one of them could be turned against him. They smiled like spies. They played like rivals. One wrong word whispered to the wrong ear, and someone would disappear. No one asked where they went. They knew not to. He learned to smile with his mouth, not his eyes, and never, ever first. When people picture royalty, they see luxury. But this wasn't luxury. It was a performance of it. Silken robes, yes, but robes that felt like chains. Feasts, yes, but with no real taste. He lived surrounded by beauty, but starved of affection. He was told he was blessed. But even at that age, he sensed the lie. He wasn't being raised. He was being sculpted, not into a man, into a myth. A pharaoh's education began with a scroll, not a smile. There were no morning cartoons, No messy finger paintings, just ritual. From sunrise to sunset, he was taught everything. Everything, that is, except how to ask questions. The curriculum was carved in stone, literally. Every lesson had one purpose: shape a god, not raise a boy. He learned symbols before he learned emotions, and by the time he was old enough to wonder why, the answer was already scripted. History was rewritten to serve him. But that didn't mean he was allowed to explore it. Instead, he memorized victories that never happened, treaties that were never signed, and ancestors who never existed. Truth was optional. Control was not. He was taught to recite, not to understand. If he questioned the past, he risked unraveling the myth. And myths were sacred, even when they contradicted themselves. Priests delivered his lessons in poetic riddles, every phrase cloaked in metaphor. Your breath is the wind of Ma'at. Your gaze shall bend rivers. Pretty, yes. Useful? Not really. But that wasn't the point. It wasn't about knowledge, it was about reverence. He wasn't taught to solve problems, he was taught to embody answers, even when the questions weren't his. He learned mathematics to build temples, astronomy to align tombs, language to issue decrees he wouldn't write himself. Every subject had a purpose, and that purpose was service, to the gods, to the empire, to tradition, never to curiosity. He could recite 7 names for the Nile, but he couldn't ask where it ended, because that wasn't his role. He wasn't there to discover. He was there to perform. Mistakes were not tolerated. One wrong word during recitation, and he'd be corrected in front of the court. Humiliation was a teaching tool, because gods weren't supposed to make mistakes. He learned to smile through confusion, to nod when unsure. Better to appear wise than admit ignorance. Over time, he stopped noticing the difference. Pretending became habit, and habit became identity. Even his body was part of the lesson. He was taught how to stand, not just tall, but divinely still. How to walk, not quickly, but ceremonially. He had to sit in silence while elders described him as the wisest of all rulers, even when he had nothing to say. They fed him compliments until he starved for honesty. But honesty wasn't part of the curriculum. Obedience was. And so he became fluent in the one language they valued most: control. Not over others, over himself. He could repeat every hymn. He could name every deity. But he couldn't name what he wanted. No one ever asked. No one ever taught him how to wonder. And that's what made it disturbing. Not the things he learned, but the things he was never allowed to. He was never alone. Not once. Not when he woke. Not when he bathed. Not even in sleep. There was always someone watching. Priests in white linen robes, quiet as statues, present in every room. They called it guidance, but it was surveillance. He couldn't tie a sash without their approval. Couldn't scratch an itch without it being recorded in a scroll. Every breath he took had a witness, and every witness had an agenda. The priests weren't just mentors, they were gatekeepers. They controlled the rituals, they controlled the gods, and most importantly, they controlled him. They told him what dreams meant, they told him when to speak, even what mood to project during ceremonies. Happy today, stoic tomorrow, grieving on command. He was a puppet draped in gold, and the strings were invisible only to him. They whispered sweet nothings in divine language. Chosen one, living God, descendant of Ra. But behind the scenes, they plotted, not to dethrone him, but to direct him. A pharaoh was powerful only when predictable, so they made sure he was never unpredictable. Gifts became rewards for obedience. Withheld blessings became warnings. He didn't rule with might. He ruled by permission. Permission granted by the men behind the curtain. When he was still a child, one priest became his shadow. Always 5 steps behind, never ahead, never out of sight. He was called the divine interpreter. But he interpreted more than rituals. He interpreted the boy's moods, impulses, hesitations. He learned the Pharaoh better than the Pharaoh knew himself. And over time, the boy stopped asking why he was followed. He accepted it because resistance had no reward. They trained him to smile on command, to feign serenity in moments of panic, to give blessings with hollow hands. Behind the mask of royalty was an actor with no script of his own. Every move was choreographed. Even moments of spontaneity were rehearsed in private. If he deviated, they corrected him. Not always harshly, sometimes with soft warnings, sometimes with silence, but always with power. When he was old enough to notice, he realized something chilling. The priests never aged, or rather they were replaced so seamlessly it didn't matter. A new face, same eyes, same robes, same words. The machine of manipulation had no beginning or end, only roles to be filled. He wasn't being raised to rule. He was being conditioned to obey, to smile while being steered. In stories, the Pharaoh stood above the world. But in truth, he stood at the center of a web, not the spider, the fly. Entangled by customs, bound by rituals, and shadowed by those who claimed to serve him. He was a king in name, but a prisoner in practice. And the cruelest part, he was taught to thank them for it. He was never alone, but he was always lonely. The palace halls echoed with voices, but none of them were for him. Not really. Every smile aimed his way had purpose. Every compliment had calculation. He was the most powerful boy in Egypt, yet had no one to whisper secrets to, no one to sit beside him and laugh, because to be close to the Pharaoh wasn't friendship, it was strategy. Children his age were introduced as companions, but they weren't chosen for kindness. They were chosen for bloodlines, sons of generals, daughters of noblemen, each one placed beside him like chess pieces. He wasn't allowed to like or dislike them. He had to tolerate them all, because tomorrow one might become an ally, or worse, an enemy cloaked in silk. He learned early that trust was a weakness. Confide in the wrong person, and it'd echo through the palace before sunset. Say the wrong thing, and it became a prophecy. He watched other children vanish from his court, some sent away, some just gone. No explanations, no questions allowed. He learned to speak in layers, truth on the bottom, politeness on top. Even his pets weren't truly his. A lion cub, gifted on his 7th birthday, was paraded before guests as a symbol of his divine strength, but it slept in a temple, not his room. He was allowed to pet it only when handlers approved. Even affection was scheduled. Even joy had limits. The cub was his in name, just like everything else. He envied the servants, not their lives, but their freedom to whisper without fear, to tease one another, to cry when sad. Their world seemed small, but real. His world was enormous, but hollow. He tried once to joke with a cook's apprentice. The next day the boy was reassigned, no explanation, just gone. Affection was dangerous, so he learned to suppress it. Advisors flooded his days, each one eager to earn his favor. But their eyes weren't warm, they were calculating. Every yes they said meant, "I'll use this later." Every agreement was a trap. He smiled at them, bowed to them, but never believed them, because none of them wanted him happy. They wanted him predictable. Predictability was easier to manage than emotion. The crown on his head was never heavy, but the weight in his chest was. He stood above thousands, and yet had no one beside him. Every room filled with worshippers, but not a single friend. He wasn't just taught to be a god. He was taught to be alone, because a loved pharaoh might act with heart, but a lonely one could be controlled. He was still a child when he first saw death. Not war, not battle, just quiet, ceremonial absence. A servant who coughed too long. An uncle who asked too many questions. Their names weren't spoken again. No one cried aloud. No one asked where they went. He learned that grief had rules, and silence was one of them. Death wasn't rare in the palace. It was expected, and always explained away as fate. When he turned 10, they told him he'd marry. Not someday. Soon. The bride was chosen. His cousin, barely older. They told him it was sacred, that bloodlines must stay pure, that the gods approved. He didn't feel holy. He felt cornered. He barely understood affection, let alone marriage. But this wasn't about love. It was about dynasty. And he didn't have a say. The wedding was beautiful. Flowers, gold, music echoing through the palace halls. But he barely remembered it. What he remembered was the moment afterward, when his new wife whispered, "I don't want this either." They both smiled in public. They both bowed in private. But in that moment, they were two children, dressed as rulers, trapped in someone else's story. Marriage brought new rituals, new expectations. He was now expected to father children. He didn't understand how, he didn't understand why. But priests spoke of it as duty, as legacy. They told him the gods were watching. Every failure to produce an heir was treated as a spiritual offense. He was taught that his body wasn't his. It was a tool, and tools must be useful. To the outside world, he looked content. He had a wife, soon concubines, a growing court, but he was more alone than ever. Each new addition to his life came with more layers of lies. He smiled because he had to. He nodded because it was expected. He laughed because people were watching, not because anything was funny. He was no longer a child, just a symbol. He started lying too, saying he felt the gods in dreams he never had, claiming joy during ceremonies that felt empty. Each lie made the next easier. He lied so well. He almost believed himself. Almost. But then he'd catch his own reflection, see the exhaustion in his eyes. And remember, the crown didn't make him more than human. It just forced him to pretend he was. By the time he turned 15, he had a wife he didn't choose, servants who spied on him, and advisors who praised him too loudly. But no truth, no joy, no peace. His life was filled with ceremonies and statues and songs, but beneath it all was a quiet truth he couldn't say aloud. Everything sacred was built on silence, and every silence was a lie. The coronation was meant to be glorious. Drums thundered, priests chanted, crowds lined the streets. But inside the boy, there was no celebration. There was dread, because he knew this wasn't a ceremony. It was a sentence. He wasn't ascending. He was being locked in. The throne wasn't a seat. It was a cage. A gilded one, yes, but a cage nonetheless. And today, they sealed the door behind him. They shaved his head and painted his scalp with sacred oils. Each brushstroke was a vow. To the gods, to the dead, to a future he couldn't control. He was wrapped in linen like a living mummy, prepared not for death, but for transformation. The boy would disappear today. In his place, they would crown a god. But the god had no voice, no freedom, only expectation. They placed the crook and flail in his hands, symbols of power, symbols of control. But they were heavy, not just in weight, in meaning. They told him these were tools of kings, but they felt more like chains. He held them up as required, smiled as instructed, and wondered if anyone could see his hands trembling beneath the gold. He was paraded past his people. Thousands bowed. Trumpets blared. He waved, but he didn't feel seen. He felt displayed, like a statue that moved. Eyes followed him, not with affection, but with duty. To them he was already divine. To him he was still pretending, and no one dared say otherwise. Inside the temple, the rituals grew stranger. He was made to stand before a statue of Ra, recite words he didn't understand, and stare into burning incense until his eyes watered. They said the smoke would carry his soul upward, He didn't feel lifted. He felt lost. Each word was rehearsed, each gesture choreographed. There was no room for sincerity, only spectacle. The high priest placed the crown on his head, double-layered, North and South Egypt united. But unity was just a symbol. So was the crown. It didn't bring clarity. It brought pressure. The room erupted in applause. He stood still, because now stillness was sacred. Stillness meant control, and control meant survival. When the ceremony ended, he was taken to a private room, not to rest, to be briefed on treaties, on enemies, on expectations. He wasn't asked how he felt. No one asked if he was ready, because that didn't matter. He was no longer a person. He was an office, a throne with a heartbeat, a prisoner dressed in divine silk, and no one would come to set him free. The temples weren't just places of worship. They were machines, complex, sacred, and always hungry. And the Pharaoh was now part of that machine, an essential gear constantly spinning. From the outside, it looked holy. Stone columns, golden altars, painted ceilings. But inside, it was bureaucracy dressed as ritual. And he, the supposed God-king, was merely its most polished servant, one who couldn't ever leave. Each morning began the same. Ritual bathing, ritual clothing, ritual silence. Before he even spoke, he'd been cleansed in sacred water and perfumed with myrrh. He wasn't allowed to dress himself. The robe had to be tied just so. The headdress adjusted to precise angles. Everything had meaning. Even his silence was a form of worship. But it didn't feel spiritual. It felt mechanical. The priests scheduled every moment. He was told when to eat, when to walk, when to pray. Each gesture was predetermined. Each word vetted. Even spontaneity had to be rehearsed. They told him the gods demanded it. But he began to wonder. Did the gods really need this much paperwork, or did the temple just need him to stay busy, so he wouldn't notice the cage tightening? He was not the head of the temple. He was the face. The priests controlled the records, the land, the grain, the gold. They decided which prophecies to announce, which dreams to declare divine. And the Pharaoh? He nodded. He repeated. He performed. He blessed crops and signed scrolls he didn't write. He was worshipped by people, but owned by the temple. Sometimes he caught glimpses of what lay beyond. A child laughing in the street. A woman dancing with no audience. A fisherman singing a song with no script. And for a moment, he felt envy. Because those lives weren't holy. But they were free. His holiness was suffocating, built on rituals he couldn't question, and duties he couldn't escape. There were festivals, of course, parades, public ceremonies, moments where he could wave and smile. But even those were planned to the second. He wasn't celebrating. He was performing celebration. Every move dictated. Every line rehearsed. And if he ever stumbled, it wasn't just a mistake. It was an omen. A sign the gods were displeased. So he made sure never to stumble. Years passed like this, each day repeating with sacred precision, each thought monitored by eyes in white linen. He was told he was the voice of the gods, but he never got to speak his own mind. And deep down, he began to understand. He would never leave the temple, not truly. Even in death, his tomb would be carved by those same hands. Still watching, still directing, still in control. Desire in the palace was never private. It was recorded, scheduled, controlled. The Pharaoh's body wasn't his. It was a symbol of fertility, legacy, and divine strength. So when he reached adolescence, they told him what came next. He would take wives, many. Each one chosen not for love but for lineage, cousins, nobles, even sisters, because bloodlines were everything, even if it meant pretending not to feel uncomfortable in your own skin. They said it was sacred. That divine blood must not be diluted. that his love life was a national matter. But sacredness didn't make it less awkward. He barely understood his own desires. Now he was expected to fulfill others' expectations. Weddings happened behind closed doors. Sometimes he didn't even meet the bride until the ceremony. She'd bow, he'd nod, and just like that, they were bound for life. Every wife had a role. One was for heirs, one for political unity, one for calming the priesthood. They were chess pieces in silk, and so was he. Affection wasn't forbidden. It just wasn't encouraged. The palace whispered about who he favored, but never asked who he wanted, because desire didn't matter, only appearances did. And if he loved the wrong person, that person could vanish. Desire still lived, though, quietly. It crept in through glances, gestures, brief smiles across temple halls. But those feelings were dangerous. Even a look held too long could trigger suspicion. He once caught the gaze of a servant girl. She smiled. A day later, she was reassigned to a distant estate. No explanation. Just gone. He learned to look without seeing, to feel without reacting, to want nothing at all. The harem was said to be luxurious, perfumed air, silken sheets. But it felt like a gallery of strangers, dozens of women each waiting to be chosen, each knowing their place. He entered like an actor walking into a scene, scripted, expected, surrounded by beauty, but starved for connection. He spoke to them with practiced charm. They responded with laughter rehearsed for years. Sometimes he wondered if any of them liked him, the real him, not the title, not the face on statues, just the boy inside the robes. But how could they? No one had ever met him. Not fully. He hadn't even met himself. Desire, in theory, was part of power, but in practice, it was a wound. Always there, never allowed to heal. The priest told him dreams of passion were divine signs, visions from the gods. But he stopped believing that. Because the dreams didn't come with blessings. They came with shame. He feared what they meant. Feared they would be read aloud, interpreted, used against him. So he stopped dreaming. Or at least, he stopped admitting he did. Even in sleep. He was never truly free. Love songs were still sung in the gardens. He heard them sometimes drifting through open windows. Simple melodies about longing and devotion. He envied them. Not the music, the freedom. To choose, to want, to be wanted. But his life had no space for such things. Desire was not his own. It belonged to the empire, and whatever warmth it offered was always taken back by morning. There was no privacy in the palace, not for eating, not for bathing, and certainly not for intimacy. Every room had eyes, servants, advisors, holy men pretending to pray. Even in his private chambers, he was not alone. The state watched everything, not out of concern, but out of control. Because a pharaoh's love life wasn't personal. It was political theater, and every touch carried consequences. He was told when to visit his wives, when to father heirs, when to appear affectionate. His most intimate moments were scheduled like meetings. Miss one, and rumors would swirl. Attend too often. And suspicion would follow. Favoritism could anger the priests, or worse, embolden a wife's family. So he learned to be equal, equally distant, equally cold. He became a mirror, reflecting what others needed to see. He once kissed a woman gently, not because it was required, but because he wanted to. It was quiet, brief, human, but by morning, half the court knew. Whispers followed him through the halls. Some smiled, others plotted. That single kiss shifted alliances, sparked jealousy, and nearly collapsed a marriage arrangement. So he stopped trying. Even genuine affection was a liability. Letters were read before they reached him, gifts inspected. Every poem sent his way was scanned for hidden meaning. Every gesture of love became suspect, not just to protect him, but to protect those in power. If someone loved him, they might influence him. If someone touched his heart, they might touch his decisions, so no one was allowed to touch too deeply, not even him. The harem had guards, not to protect the women, to prevent them from leaving. Each night he visited, the doors closed behind him with a thud, but even then, servants remained within earshot. He couldn't whisper, he couldn't exhale too loudly. Even intimacy had an audience, and the applause never came. On festival days, he paraded beside his queen, hand in hand, crowned and perfect. She'd smile, he'd wave, and the people would cheer. But they didn't see the space between their fingers, the way their palms barely touched. They were symbols, not spouses, chosen for lineage, paraded for legitimacy. Behind closed doors, there were no arguments, just silence. Polite, rehearsed, suffocating silence. He sometimes dreamed of escaping, not from the palace, but from the eyes, of walking into a room and not being observed, of choosing who to touch, who to love, of saying, "I miss you," without someone scribbling it into a ledger. But even dreams felt monitored. He began to censor them too. He taught himself not to hope, because hope made the cage feel tighter. The state claimed his body, his image, his affection. He existed in statues and scrolls, but not in anyone's arms. Every caress was a ritual, every glance rehearsed. He was the most wanted man in Egypt. But not as a person, as a myth, a god. And gods, they said, do not need love. But he did. And that was the cruelest part of all. They bowed when he passed. They kissed the ground at his feet. They called him Horus, called him divine, called him eternal. But not one of them knew his favorite food. Not one could name the last time he laughed. Worship was everywhere, yet it never touched him. He was praised by thousands, adored by millions, and understood by no one. Because in Egypt, gods didn't need identity, only image. Statues of him rose across the land, towering, perfect, cold, each one carved by hands that had never seen his real expression. Each one based on an ideal, not a man. They captured his jawline, but not his fatigue, his posture, but not his pain. He walked among them like a ghost among copies, wondering if anyone would notice, if he disappeared and sent a look-alike in his place. Priests praised him daily. Scribes etched his greatness into history, but he wasn't allowed to contradict it. If he showed weakness, they said he was being tested. If he asked questions, they called it wisdom, even when he didn't speak at all. They praised his divine silence. He could do nothing and still be celebrated. But that kind of praise felt like a prison, soft and suffocating. He wasn't allowed to be curious. If he admired a farmer's hands, it became a symbol of his connection to the earth. If he watched children play, it became a statement on his generosity. Every action had to mean something. Every glance was read like scripture. He became afraid to move without reason, afraid to live without someone turning it into ceremony. The people left offerings in his name, fruit, perfume, golden trinkets. They wept before his image, begging for mercy. But he couldn't offer them any, because no one ever asked him how he felt. They spoke to him, not with him. He stood above them on balconies, a silent shape in the sun, and knew they worshipped. Not the boy, not the man, but the myth, even in solitude. He wasn't alone. His inner voice grew quieter, drowned out by the chants of others. He began to forget who he was beneath the layers, not out of arrogance, but exhaustion. It's hard to remember yourself when everyone insists you're someone else, especially when you're rewarded for playing along. There were moments when he caught glimpses. A reflection in a bowl of water, a shadow that moved too slowly, a feeling that this was never who he wanted to be. But the moment passed. Always. The mask was too tight, the performance too loud. He'd blink, straighten his shoulders, and return to being a god. Because doubt wasn't divine, and divinity didn't get days off. He was worshipped like a legend, treated like a statue, and walked through life like a man no one truly saw. He ruled the richest land on earth, but didn't know who he was without his titles. Strangers bowed, but no one listened. No one asked, "What do you need?" And after a while, he stopped asking himself too. Because being invisible is easier. When everyone pretends they see you, a cough could start a crisis, a fever could threaten the throne. The Pharaoh was not allowed to get sick, not because he was immortal, but because weakness shattered the illusion. Every time he sneezed, someone wrote it down. Was it a sign? Was it a warning? They didn't ask if he was okay. They asked what the gods were trying to say. So he learned to hide the ache, to sweat in silence. Doctors were priests first, healers second. Their treatments were spells. Their diagnosis, divine messages. He couldn't say, "It hurts here." He had to say, "Ra tests me through pain." Medicine wasn't for healing. It was for preserving the myth. Even when his body trembled, he was expected to appear strong, because strength wasn't optional. It was required, even if it killed him slowly. When sadness came, it had to wear a mask too. No crying, no slouching, no signs of sorrow. He was taught early that grief was disorder, and disorder was dangerous. When his brother died, he wasn't given time to mourn. He was placed before a crowd and told to speak of legacy, of gods, of eternal light. No one asked about the empty chair, only the ritual. He mastered the art of mourning in silence, smiling with wet eyes, nodding through eulogies. Every funeral became performance, every emotion a script. He missed people he couldn't name aloud, lost friendships he never got to form. And in the quiet hours, he stared at the ceiling, wondering if sadness counted, if no one saw it, if a god wept in secret. Did it still make him human? Palace walls didn't echo with comfort. There were no shoulders to lean on, only advisors who reminded him to appear divine. Even his queen was more symbol than partner. When he faltered, they called it fatigue. When he broke, they called it transformation. The truth was never acknowledged, just renamed. Pain was repackaged as purpose, sorrow as sacrifice. He envied the villagers again, the ones who cried in the streets, who embraced their grief, who shouted, wailed, mourned out loud. He longed for the release, the permission to be broken. But he didn't get that luxury. He was the unshakable one, the divine anchor. So he held it all inside, until even his own body stopped listening. His health began to slip, but no one admitted it. Not aloud. They adjusted the lighting in court, placed cushions beneath his robes, reduced his hours in the sun. Subtle things, things that wouldn't show in statues. He was still drawn tall on temple walls, still painted in perfect symmetry, but the man inside that image was fading quietly. He was not allowed to feel, not openly, not honestly. Every emotion was filtered through ritual, blunted by ceremony, buried under titles. He could rule an empire, but couldn't say, "I'm tired." He could summon armies, but couldn't whisper, "I'm scared." That was the bargain. Be divine, be eternal, but never, ever be real. And in time, even he forgot what real had ever felt like. He had hundreds of servants, each one sworn to silence, Each one trained to bow, to clean, to vanish, but some did more than serve. Some listened, and some remembered. In a palace where walls had ears, servants became the walls. They saw things the advisors missed, heard things the priests ignored. And the Pharaoh, despite his status, could never be sure which hand that fed him was the one quietly sharpening the blade. There was one servant, quiet, precise, always watching. He poured wine at the same hour, lit incense with the same tilt of the wrist, never spoke out of turn, never asked for anything. And that's what made him dangerous, because the most loyal ones are often the ones no one notices, and the ones no one notices can see everything. The Pharaoh began to sense it. A glance held too long, a question that felt rehearsed. The servant didn't just know the schedule, he knew the moods. He appeared before the Pharaoh asked, answered before questions formed. It was impressive, too impressive. At first, the Pharaoh found comfort in the routine. Then he began to feel watched, not just served, monitored. Servants moved between worlds. They weren't royalty, but they weren't outsiders. They slipped through chambers and corridors like shadows. They saw the king's weakness, his sleepless nights, his hushed arguments. They saw him weep when no one else could. And sometimes, seeing was power. One day, a secret leaked, something only a few could have known. And this servant had been there, present, silent, but present. The rumor spread fast, too fast, and in the palace, rumors were more dangerous than poison. They could collapse a treaty, start a war, destroy a reign. The Pharaoh summoned his advisors, but no one took responsibility. No one had to. The damage was already done. That night, the servant didn't report for duty. He didn't vanish. Not yet. He was reassigned, quietly, to a lower post, farther from the royal chambers. It wasn't punishment. It was precaution. A reminder that those who knew too much would be pushed just far enough away to be forgotten, but not far enough to speak freely. The Pharaoh missed his presence, but never said so aloud. He'd grown used to the routine, to the quiet nods and gentle footsteps. He realized something unsettling. He had trusted the servant, more than his wives, more than his scribes, and that trust, that dangerous trust, had grown in silence. Now it was gone, and the silence felt sharper. The next morning, his sandals were tied by a new hand. The incense was off by a degree. The wine tasted the same, but it didn't feel right. The trust was broken, not by betrayal, but by knowing it had ever existed. He understood now why pharaohs built walls so high, why they never let anyone close, because the moment someone sees you bleed, they stop seeing you as divine. The servant didn't return. No records, no farewell. Just another name erased from the palace. The pharaoh sat alone that evening, surrounded by gold and silence. And for the first time, he realized something chilling. It wasn't the poisoners or the generals he feared most. It was the quiet ones, the ones who saw everything, said nothing, and walked away, knowing more than any man should. They stood beside him in every painting, advisors, old men with wise eyes, long robes, measured voices. To the public, they were loyal counselors. To the palace, they were essential. To the pharaoh, they were a threat, because each one had outlived kings. And any man who survives that many reigns knows how to manipulate one. Their smiles were rehearsed, their praise poisoned with strategy. They never raised swords. They didn't need to. Their weapons were words, whispers, suggestions, silences, a gesture here, a nod there. They made decisions seem like his, even when they weren't. He thought he was leading, but they were steering, and the more he trusted them, the more tightly they wrapped him in the illusion of choice. Meetings stretched for hours, filled with vague advice and sacred references. Ra would approve. The ancestors would frown upon that. They hid politics in piety, wrapped control in ceremony. He'd make proclamations, then hear them quoted back to him later. Twisted, reworded, redirected. By the time he realized it, his own thoughts weren't entirely his. They were filtered through council mouths. There was always one who smiled too much, one who bowed too low, who agreed too quickly. He'd act harmless, like a loyal uncle. But his reach extended through every corner of the court. He placed relatives in temples, friends in military ranks. He never contradicted the Pharaoh. He didn't need to. He simply waited for the moment, when silence said more than protest ever could. Advisors were never punished. They were too respected, too spiritually aligned. Even when caught in lies, they recited prayers, spoke of omens, and slipped back into favor, because challenging them meant challenging the gods. And a pharaoh could question his servants, but to question his advisors, that risked unraveling the divine story itself. He began to test them, dropping false ideas into meetings, watching which ones leaked, planting bait in conversations to see who returned with a dagger. Each trial revealed a truth. They weren't just managing the state. They were managing him, and they were good at it. So good that even when he knew, he couldn't act, because exposure meant exposing his own weakness. Once he dismissed one, quietly, respectfully. The man left the palace smiling, and 3 weeks later, grain shipments were delayed, temple festivals were disrupted, rumors spread, the gods were displeased. Coincidence, they said, but he knew better. Power never left quietly. It lingered, in shadows, in scrolls, in whispered warnings passed down in the market stalls. He envied simpler rulers, the warrior kings, who conquered with swords. Their enemies were visible, predictable, but his enemies wore perfume, quoted scripture, and bowed lower than necessary. They poisoned not with vials, but with influence. And by the time you realized it, your empire wasn't yours anymore. It was theirs, and they just let you wear the crown. He stood before his mirror one night, crown in hand, advisors waiting behind the curtain, and he asked himself, am I the king? Or just the face they need? The answer didn't come. It never did. Because true power in Egypt was rarely shouted. It was whispered and worn like perfume, invisible, but everywhere. And the throne he sat on was built on those whispers. Every bite was a gamble, every sip a ritual. The pharaoh ate alone, but never without an audience. Tasters, priests, guards, not for company, for safety. Because in a palace built on secrets, poison was more common than knives. It didn't leave blood, it didn't scream, it just silenced. Quickly, quietly. The threat didn't wear armor. It wore honey glaze, gilded cups, and freshly sliced figs. Food was tested in layers. First, a servant would taste. Then a priest would bless. Then an astrologer might inspect the hour. Was it an auspicious time to swallow? Was the moon too high? The scent too sweet? If anything felt off, the meal was discarded. No questions asked. And still, some poison made it through. Because fear, like poison, had no smell. He grew to distrust sweetness. Grapes, pomegranates, honey-soaked pastries. They reminded him of danger, of things that killed slowly. Pleasure and threat became indistinguishable. He chewed cautiously. Even water had to be filtered through ritual. If he drank too fast, someone might raise an eyebrow. Too slow. They'd say he sensed an omen. There was no winning, only surviving. Not all poisons were physical. Some were spoken, whispers added to wine, rumors folded into bread. An innocent dessert could be followed by scandal, A compliment delivered by a cook might lead to an accusation. Why was he so kind? Was he bribed? Even generosity became suspicious, so the pharaoh learned to eat, with one eye open. Ceremony was supposed to protect him. Each dish offered to the gods first, each ingredient chanted over. But the chants were mumbled, the gods were silent, and the danger didn't come from outsiders. It came from within, from the jealous, the ambitious, the hungry not for food but for his throne. And they didn't need a sword, just access to the spice rack. He began skipping meals, not out of vanity, out of fear. A meal untouched was a day he might survive. The cooks noticed. So did the priests. They said he insulted the gods. They said his fasting unbalanced the divine rhythm. But they didn't taste the weight behind every bite. They didn't carry the burden of uncertainty. They just watched him chew around danger. Food tasters were rotated weekly. Too long in the role, and one might get ideas. Too short, and they might not notice subtleties. One taster once collapsed mid-meal. No cause found, no autopsy allowed. His family was compensated, and no one spoke of it again. The pharaoh didn't sleep that night, not because he was sad, because he was still hungry. He started smelling every dish himself, not with reverence, with suspicion. He trained his nose like a soldier trains his sword. He watched for too much saffron, too little cinnamon, an unfamiliar oil, a delayed reaction from the taster. Every meal became a battlefield. No blood, but casualties, nonetheless. Paranoia settled in like salt in stew, slow, invisible but inescapable. He wondered which bite would be the last, which friend would turn, which servant would hesitate too long. He ate to live, but feared living through eating. And so the table that should have been a place of rest became an altar of calculation. Because in Egypt, to feed a god was to risk killing one. The palace kitchen smelled of roasted lamb, crushed garlic, and sweat. Not from heat alone, but from tension. It was a battlefield with no armor, only aprons. Cooks didn't wield blades, they wielded influence. Every dish they touched passed through layers of control, but still, one drop, one grain, one slip, and the whole empire could collapse. They weren't just feeding a pharaoh, they were fueling a god's illusion, and the pressure was unbearable. There were hierarchies in the kitchen. Head chefs ruled like generals, apprentices scrambled like infantry, and spies. They moved like smoke, unseen but always present. Everyone knew the consequences. One wrong spice, one delay in serving, and suspicion would fall like a blade. People had vanished for less. Some claimed they retired, others whispered of darker fates, but everyone kept stirring their pots and looking over their shoulders. Bribes were common. Gold slipped into flour sacks, coins sewn into apron linings. Noble families tried to influence meals, not to harm the pharaoh, but to charm him. Add a dish he favored. Remove one tied to a bad omen. If he smiled during dinner, a family might rise in rank. If he frowned, someone could lose a position. Food became politics, and flavor was just the wrapping. Rivalries boiled hotter than the stews. One cook accused another of spoiling lentils on purpose. Another claimed someone switched the salt and sugar jars. Even the bread was contested. Too dense, too dry, too sacred. One baker was found weeping in the storeroom, terrified that his flatbread had cracked improperly. A bad omen, they said. And in Egypt, bad omens had consequences beyond superstition. The storage rooms were locked tight, not for theft, for sabotage. Olive oil could be poisoned, grains tampered, wine spiked with silence. Guards patrolled the corridors, but even they weren't trusted. It wasn't about protection. It was about control. The temple had spies in the pantry. The military had ears near the spice racks. The kitchen didn't just serve the crown, it served agendas. Once, a lowly assistant found a scorpion in the herb basket. Was it an accident? No one knew. No one spoke. But the basket was burned. The assistant was relocated, and the kitchen resumed like nothing happened, because to acknowledge danger was to invite it. And in this battlefield, silence was armor. Denial was a shield. You couldn't flinch, even when your life depended on it. Tasters were rotated through the kitchen daily, not for efficiency, for surveillance, to watch who lingered too long near the bread, who tasted something they weren't supposed to, who asked questions about ingredients. And if a taster ever went missing, they were replaced without mention. A new face, same uniform, same quiet eyes. Despite the danger, some still took pride in their work. They carved dates into roses, dusted pastries with powdered almonds shaped like stars. They couldn't protect the Pharaoh, but they could give him a moment of sweetness. Even if he didn't notice, even if he feared it, that moment mattered. To them. Because in a world ruled by fear, beauty was rebellion. The kitchen never slept. Not because meals were constant, but because paranoia was. It simmered on every flame, hid in every recipe. They served the most powerful man alive. But they lived as if they were already condemned. The battlefield didn't need war cries, just ladles, just knives, just quiet, trembling hands, hoping the next dish wasn't their last. The palace was a maze, not just in shape, but in design. Behind every wall was a space, behind every space a purpose. Secret rooms, hidden passages, false doors built to mislead or observe. Some led nowhere, some led to chambers only 3 people in Egypt knew existed. The Pharaoh lived in a fortress of illusions, and he never knew who might be listening. Just beyond the marble. Doors opened without sound, tapestries hid entryways, floor tiles gave slightly underfoot, revealing passageways built centuries before. Some rooms were for escape, others were for ambush. Every corner of his home was layered in design, meant to protect, but also to contain. The palace wasn't just his sanctuary, it was a stage, and sometimes a trap. The watching eyes were not imaginary. They belonged to men trained for silence. Some wore robes, some wore armor, most wore smiles. They lived in shadows, ate in shadows, slept beside the halls. They didn't guard the Pharaoh. They monitored him. Their loyalty wasn't to the man. It was to the idea, the throne, and anything or anyone that threatened it. Even his private chamber wasn't private. The walls were thick. But sound still carried. A misplaced whisper could echo. A complaint overheard could spark rumors. So he stopped speaking freely, even when alone. He imagined voices in the walls, felt breath behind closed doors. The silence of the palace was never truly silent. It listened. It remembered. The advisors insisted the secret rooms were necessary. For his safety, they said. For emergencies. For discretion. But none of them said how often those rooms were used. To test loyalty, to plant lies, to hide intentions. One wall in his study led to a room filled with scrolls. Records of conversations he didn't know had been recorded. Guards rotated in pairs, but no pair stayed together too long. To prevent loyalty, to prevent conspiracy. He noticed it one morning. A familiar face gone. No farewell. Just replaced. When he asked, the answer was polite and vague. The stars demanded a change, but he knew better. Stars didn't shuffle guards. People did, and for reasons they'd never admit. A servant once stumbled upon a door he wasn't meant to find. He disappeared that night. His name was removed from the rolls, his belongings redistributed. The staff spoke of him, as if he'd never existed, and the Pharaoh watched, as even memory was rewritten with efficiency. That was power, not just the ability to punish, but to erase. He began testing the walls, dropping false words, whispering invented fears, and like clockwork, the responses came. An advisor repeating back a phrase, a priest offering prayers he hadn't requested. The maze was listening, always. It didn't blink, it didn't sleep. And once he saw it, he could never unsee it. The palace wasn't haunted, it was alive, built to watch, to trap, to guide its king without him ever noticing. He ruled from the center, but walked through his days, like a pawn on a gilded board. Every wall, every echo reminded him he wasn't the only one watching, and perhaps not even the most powerful. There was a mirror in his chamber, framed in gold, polished obsidian. Every morning he stood before it, as servants adjusted his crown, painted his eyes, smoothed the creases in his robe. But the longer he stared, the less he recognized the figure staring back. It was him, but it wasn't. It was the version others needed. Stoic, divine, flawless. It didn't blink unless he did. It didn't breathe. He tried once to speak to it, not out loud, but with a look, a question. Are you real? The mirror offered nothing. No answer, no comfort. Just the weight of a face that never changed, even when he felt like he was disappearing. And maybe he was. Because when the world insists you're perfect, you stop being a person. You become a statue that moves. The mirror saw things no one else could. The subtle tremor in his hands, the swelling around his eyes after sleepless nights, the way his shoulders curled when no one watched. These were not things gods did, so they were never mentioned. His attendants polished the mirror daily, but it still reflected fatigue. It still caught glimpses of the boy beneath the crown. Rumors said mirrors could trap souls. Priests warned against staring too long. But he couldn't help it. Some days, it was the only honest conversation he had. No flattery, no ceremony, just silence, and the slow, painful realization that he didn't know what his real face looked like anymore. Was it the painted one? The smiling one? Or the one he never let anyone see? He began testing the mirror, changing expressions quickly, watching how long the image took to follow. It always kept pace. But there were moments, brief flickers, where it felt delayed, a blink that lasted too long, a smile that didn't feel quite synced. He knew it was his mind playing tricks. He hoped it was. Because if the mirror lied, then who was telling the truth? One night, in a moment of defiance, he removed his crown, stared at himself, bareheaded, unpainted, vulnerable, and for a second, he felt human, not a pharaoh, not a myth, just a man. But the next morning, the mirror reflected only the lie again, and the man he'd seen the night before was gone. Servants were trained to never look into it. They averted their eyes, not out of respect, out of fear. Mirrors held more than reflection. They held memory. And in a place built on secrets, memory was dangerous. The mirror saw every transformation, every flinch, every betrayal. But it told no one, not even him. There were whispers in court about mirrors cracking on their own, about reflections that moved independently. He dismissed them. Until one morning, a faint hairline crack appeared across the lower corner of his own. No one could explain it. No one dared try. They replaced the mirror, but he kept the cracked one in a hidden chamber as proof that something, some part of him, had fractured. He no longer trusted the mirror, but he still used it, because even if it lied, it was the only place he could look and almost believe he was real. Almost. In time, he learned to smile on command, to pose like a statue. But at night, he covered the glass, because some reflections weren't just false. They were reminders, of everything you lost trying to be perfect. The Pharaoh was a warrior, at least in the stories. Statues showed him riding into battle, bow drawn, enemies falling at his feet. But the truth? He didn't choose his battles. They were chosen for him. By generals, by priests, by advisors with maps they didn't bleed on, and when he rode out, he wasn't bringing justice. He was delivering spectacle, a god on horseback, sent to clean up someone else's ambition. War began in whispers. A border dispute, a stolen shipment, a bad omen interpreted as foreign aggression. It didn't matter if it made sense. It only mattered that it could be used. The court needed a display of strength. The priests needed divine balance. The generals needed glory, so the boy king was dressed in bronze and feathers, mounted on a chariot, and told to lead men into fear. He trained, of course, swordplay, archery, the stance of a warrior, but it was training for performance, not survival. His armor gleamed too brightly. His sword was too polished. Everything was built for appearance. Even his war horse was chosen more for beauty than for endurance. He was ready for paintings, not for blood. When the first battle came, he was 17. The sun rose like it had every other day, but the air felt different, heavier. Men around him whispered prayers. Some wept quietly. He tried to match their fear with calm, tried to channel the god they expected. But inside, he was just a boy in gold, waiting for someone else to shout charge. The battlefield was chaos, sand in his mouth, screams in his ears. He couldn't tell friend from enemy, couldn't breathe. His chariot jolted violently as arrows whistled past. For a moment, he forgot the rituals, forgot the image. He was just surviving, swinging, ducking, praying to the gods he supposedly embodied. And when it ended, he wasn't sure who'd won, only that he hadn't died. They declared it a triumph. Priests sang of his bravery. Scrolls praised his wisdom in combat. Scribes drew him slaying 10 men with one blow. But he knew the truth. He had been protected, surrounded by elite guards. The real fighting happened yards away, out of frame, out of memory, and the men who died were buried without names while he returned to cheers. They made him tour the bodies, not to mourn, to show command. He walked past the wounded, nodding, blessing, trying not to vomit. He saw a soldier with no arm, bow from the ground. The man whispered, "Your will be done." And the Pharaoh had to smile, like he meant it, because to show sorrow would be weakness. And weakness could start the next war. The scars on his hands faded, but the weight in his chest didn't. He returned to the palace, not as a hero, but as a haunted image of one. People bowed deeper. The statues grew taller. But the stories weren't his. They belonged to those who shaped the legend. He was a soldier now, in myth only, and no one asked if he wanted to fight again. In time, he stopped fearing war. Not because he grew brave, but because he understood its rhythm. The ritual of violence, the predictability of chaos. He became fluent in the language of conflict, but inside he remained unchanged. A figurehead sent forward, always forward, into battles he didn't start, to prove victories he never chose. He returned in silence, not on a chariot, but in a cart, shoulder dislocated, ribs bruised, skin scorched by the sun. But the procession still formed, trumpets still played, flowers were thrown. He was draped in gold, crowns straightened, and told to wave, because a god can't limp, a god can't grimace. So they painted his wounds with perfume and told him to pretend he was whole. The pain was constant, a throb behind his eyes, an ache in every joint. He couldn't lift his arm, could barely breathe when laughing. So he stopped laughing. He smiled instead. That tight, shallow version. He used when people were watching. No one asked how he felt. They asked what victory tasted like. He said, "Sweet." then excused himself before he could choke on the lie. In private, he collapsed, not into sleep, but into stillness, the kind where you don't even cry. His body wrapped in linen, blessed oils smeared on bruises. A priest whispered, "Your wounds reflect the gods' trials." But he didn't feel divine. He felt broken, used, offered like a sacrifice, then expected to rise, like nothing had happened. He dreamt of the battlefield, not with fear, but with numbness, faces blurred, screams muted. All that remained was the weight of armor and the taste of dust. He woke in cold sweats, but no one noticed. They thought it was a blessing, a vision. He didn't correct them. He let the dream become prophecy, because it was easier than explaining the truth. His next portrait was unveiled days later. He stood tall, sword raised, muscles chiseled by the artist's brush. No bandages, no bruises, just glory. He stared at the painting, wondering who it was meant to honor, because it wasn't him. It never had been. It was the version they needed, and that version never bled. Court resumed like nothing had happened. Disputes over land, tax reforms, festival preparations. He sat on his throne, back stiff with pain, and nodded at each decree. His advisors spoke for him. His scribes documented everything. He was present in body, absent in spirit, and no one dared notice, because a god at rest was still a god. One afternoon, he saw a soldier limping down a hallway. No fanfare, no gold, just linen wraps and silence. Their eyes met briefly. The soldier bowed, and for a moment they understood each other completely, not as king and subject, but as survivors of something neither could describe. Then the moment passed. The soldier was gone, and the Pharaoh was back to smiling. The temple praised his endurance, called it divine fortitude, said he bore the burden of the nation's pain. He wanted to scream. He wanted to say he was just a boy who followed orders, who got lucky, who came back with broken bones and guilt. But gods don't scream. So he clenched his jaw and nodded through the prayers. They say war forges legends, but it also fractures men. He was still standing, but never the same. Pieces of him stayed on that field, in the dust, in the silence, in the faces of the forgotten. Yet every morning, he rose, dressed, and smiled, because even shattered gods are expected to shine. He had siblings, in name, in lineage, in title. They shared blood, but not trust. From the moment they could walk, they were rivals in gold. Their lives weren't woven together. They were arranged beside him like polished weapons, shiny, useful, and dangerous if pointed the wrong way. He wasn't raised with a brother. He was raised with competition, wrapped in royal linen. Each sibling had a role. One was groomed for military command, another for temple leadership, a sister for political marriage, none for closeness, none for affection. They were chess pieces on a divine board, moved by hands older than memory. When they laughed together, eyes watched. When they argued, scrolls were filled, because sibling tension was palace currency. They were taught to flatter each other in public and outmaneuver each other in private. Every compliment held a blade, every shared glance, a possible leak. They never knew. Who reported to the priests, who whispered to the advisors. The palace was made of mirrors, but none reflected the truth, and every game of childhood felt like the first move in a war. He remembered once, as a child, his brother gave him a handmade gift, a carved wooden hawk, simple, clumsy, beautiful. He treasured it. But the next day, it vanished. His tutor warned him. Sentiment is weakness, especially toward those with a claim. He never mentioned the hawk again, and his brother never carved another. Their birthdays were celebrated together, lavish, grand, but always tense. Gifts displayed for the court to see, each one weighed, measured, interpreted. One sibling gave him a statue of Horus. Was it loyalty or a challenge to his role? Another offered a rare herb, a cure or a warning. Even kindness had edges, even generosity was strategy. They trained together under the same tutors, read the same myths, recited the same prayers, but every lesson came with comparison. Who was quicker? Who recited with more conviction? Every praise of one was a quiet rebuke of the other. They grew not like trees in a forest, but like vines in a narrow pot, twisting around each other, choking slowly, with no room to breathe. At night, he sometimes imagined what it would be like to trust them, to whisper fears, to laugh without calculation, to play like children, not heirs. But those nights were rare, and always ended the same, with the sound of footsteps outside his door, a reminder that someone was always listening, and maybe it was one of them. When one sibling fell ill, the palace held its breath, not in sorrow, in suspense. Would the balance shift? Would titles change? He visited once, offered fruit and silence. His siblings smiled weakly. "Don't worry," they whispered. "I'm not a threat anymore." He didn't know whether to feel relief or grief, so he felt nothing. It was easier. They stood beside him at ceremonies, perfect posture, perfect smiles, but their hands never touched. They posed for reliefs that would outlive them, depicting unity that never existed. Siblings in stone, together forever, even if they never truly knew one another. Because in the palace, family was function, kinship was performance, and blood was just another currency. He was expected to have sons, not for joy, not for legacy, but for succession. A pharaoh without heirs meant an empire without direction. So from the moment his first child cried, the court began preparing him to be replaced. That was the paradox. Your greatest duty was to create the person who would one day make you obsolete, and possibly dangerous. The boy was adored publicly, paraded in silks, praised by priests. Whispers of divinity swirled around him before he could form words. The people cheered, but the pharaoh watched with unease. He saw the cycle forming again, the one he had lived, a child dressed as a god, a symbol, not a son. And the symbol was gaining followers. Tutors were assigned, not for kindness but for doctrine. They taught the boy how to rule, but not how to think. He was told his father was wise, strong, immortal, but also old, waning, a vessel nearing emptiness. The pharaoh knew the lesson beneath the lesson. The boy was being shaped to believe he could do better. As the child grew, so did his court. Advisors began gravitating toward the younger son. Flattery shifted, eyes lingered. Every small act of brilliance from the boy was celebrated. Every mistake the father made was quietly amplified. He felt it like wind shifting direction, subtle but undeniable. The palace was preparing for the next face of godhood. There were rumors, always whispered, always denied, that sons had hastened their father's end. A drink tainted, a decision nudged, a word misquoted, all in the name of divine timing, all in the name of the gods. And the worst part? If it worked, if the transition was smooth, the story became noble. The son became wise. The father, forgotten. He began watching his son differently, not with affection, but with calculation. What did that glance mean? Was that smile genuine? He hated the thoughts. They rotted him, but he couldn't help it, because once the boy began to walk confidently, others began to follow, and it became clear. He was no longer the future. He was the past, still sitting upright. One night, He dreamt of his own father. Faint voice, familiar eyes, no warmth, just instruction. Step aside gracefully, he heard, or be removed forcefully. He woke with clenched fists, his son's laughter echoing from the garden below. He knew the future was coming. What he didn't know was whether he'd be allowed to meet it. He tested his son, offered conflicting counsel, delayed ceremonial rites, watched how he responded. The boy was patient, too patient, respectful on the surface, but sharp underneath. He never slipped, never stumbled, and that made him dangerous, because it meant he was already performing, already wearing the crown. In his mind, the Pharaoh still lived, still ruled, but each day he felt his shadow growing smaller, not by fate, by design, a design he had created. He looked at his son, then at his own reflection, and wondered, was this how the gods passed judgment? Not with thunder, but with a smile, from the person who would one day inherit the knife. Pharaohs weren't allowed to sleep like common men. Even rest was ritual. His bed faced east, so his dreams could catch the rising sun. Incense was burned, prayers whispered, the mattress stuffed with sacred reeds. Before he closed his eyes, a priest would stand at his bedside and ask, "What message will the gods send tonight?" Because in Egypt, sleep wasn't escape, it was surveillance. In silk sheets, every dream mattered, or so they said. If he dreamt of birds, scribes recorded it. If he woke in sweat, priests interpreted the meaning. An omen, they'd whisper, an alignment, an offense to be corrected. Even silence was suspicious. To have no dream was to have ignored the gods. He began to invent dreams. Safer that way. Easier than admitting. He often feared closing his eyes at all. Insomnia crept in, quietly at first. He'd stare at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. His body ached, his mind spiraled, but rest wouldn't visit. Too many eyes, too many expectations. He once stayed awake for 3 nights. On the 4th, they said he looked radiant. The gods have blessed him with wakeful clarity. A priest claimed. He didn't correct them. He just nodded, exhausted. They gave him herbs, not to help, but to control. Poppy and lotus, steeped in oil. It dulled his senses, softened his thoughts. Dreams came like fog, strange, heavy, uninterpretable. The priests told him they were divine. He began to forget what real sleep felt like, what rest meant. He wasn't sleeping, he was floating, and no one cared, so long as he smiled the next morning. Guards stood outside his chamber at night, not to protect him from threats, but to report his movements. When did he toss? Did he speak in his sleep? Did he wake up crying? He learned not to cry, even alone, even in the dark, because nothing in the palace was truly private. Even dreams could be turned into doctrine. One night, he dreamt of a flood, endless water swallowing statues, temples cracking, his own face submerged. He woke gasping. The next day, a storm swept through the Nile Delta, crops drowned. The dream was declared prophecy. He was praised, but he didn't feel powerful. He felt exposed, like his mind had been cracked open and filled with someone else's meaning. He stopped sharing real dreams, started describing harmless ones. A golden hawk, a field of papyrus, safe images, empty of consequence. It became a game of survival. Say too much, and your mind became a message. Say too little, and they said the gods were distant. So he crafted just enough to be divine, and just hollow enough to be left alone. His dreams changed over time. Less prophecy, more memory, faces he missed, rooms he no longer entered. His mother's voice, his brother's laugh, moments of warmth. That slipped through his fingers. As soon as he woke, And yet, those dreams felt more sacred than any vision they praised. But he never spoke of them. Some things, he decided, belonged only to him. Sleep became an act of performance, a nightly stage, lit by moonlight and managed by whispers. He lay down in gold-trimmed linens, closed his eyes, and prayed not for visions, but for peace. But peace didn't come, only more dreams, more eyes, and more mornings, where he woke as the same tired god, in the same tired palace, with the same lie on his lips. I slept well. Each sunrise felt like a verdict, a new day, a new ritual, a new demand. He didn't rise. He was raised, lifted by servants, clothed by hands that never met his gaze. He opened his eyes to incense smoke, chanted greetings, and questions he never got to ask. There was no pause, no breath, just the next expectation, and the knowledge that sleep had only delayed the weight of being. The first curse each morning was memory of what he had dreamt, of what he couldn't say. He was asked what visions he received. He gave them the same scripted answers: a falcon, a river, the sun, always rising, never drowning. But deep down, he remembered the real dream, the one where he ran and didn't stop. The second curse was ceremony. He couldn't eat until he'd greeted the gods. He couldn't bathe until the right star had passed. He couldn't breathe too deeply, without it meaning something. Each yawn was inspected. Each blink read like scripture. The priests hovered, scribes recorded. Even his silence became a performance, because pharaohs weren't allowed moods, only meanings. The third curse was prophecy. Scrolls appeared before breakfast, visions recorded by others, dreams meant for him, warnings about the Nile, about birds flying west, about shadows in temples. He was told how to feel, what to expect, how to proceed. It didn't matter if he believed them. What mattered was that he obeyed them, because to question a prophecy was to question his own divinity. The fourth curse was repetition. Every morning the same prayers, same path, same eyes watching his feet, his fingers, his posture. He began to forget which day it was. Not that it mattered. Time had blurred into a rhythm of expectations and echoes. He was no longer a man with mornings. He was a ritual, with skin. Once he tried to skip the ceremony. Just once. He stayed in bed, pretended to be unwell. Within hours, the temple filled with panic. The sun rose too fast. Birds flew wrong. Someone claimed a statue had wept. By nightfall, he was back in front of the altar, reciting lines, restoring order. The curse wasn't skipping the ritual. It was being missed. The fifth curse was flattery. Each morning came with praise. Your eyes are brighter than Ra. Your voice steadies the earth. He stopped hearing the words. They bounced off his bones, meaningless and hollow. He craved honesty, silence, even criticism. But no one would risk it, because to critique a god was to risk divine retribution, even if the god was quietly breaking. The sixth curse was the mirror, still there, still reflecting the man who had to pretend. He was made of something more than exhaustion. He studied his face, looking for changes, for cracks, for pieces of the boy he used to be. But each morning, he looked more like the statue, smoothed, empty, untouched by feeling. That was the goal, wasn't it? And finally, the seventh curse. Hope. That maybe today would be different, that someone would see him, that he could walk without guards, speak without script, wake without dread. But every morning, hope died beneath ritual, buried by expectation. He stepped into the light, wrapped in silk and gold, and whispered the same lie. He always did. I am ready, even when he wasn't. He was still young when they showed him the blueprints, the design of his tomb, sprawling halls, golden chambers, painted ceilings that mimicked the stars. They spoke of eternity, like it was an appointment. He was expected to help plan it, choose inscriptions, select sacred texts, commission statues of himself, smiling in death. The idea wasn't morbid, it was royal. Even his afterlife had a deadline. Each step of the process was ritualized. What stone to use, what spells to include, what amulets to bury. He wasn't just preparing for death. He was rehearsing it, and every decision he made was treated as divine wisdom, even when he didn't understand what half the symbols meant. Still, he nodded, approved, pretended to know what eternity should look like in paint. The tomb builders worked in secret. Their village was hidden, their mouths sealed by oath. Some would spend their entire lives carving scenes of the Pharaoh's triumphs, scenes he had never lived, battles he never fought, joys he never felt. But they didn't know that. They only knew the legend, and they were paid to make it permanent. Gold was mined for his sarcophagus. Jewelers crafted rings he would never wear. Artisans sculpted gods to guard him while he slept. His body would be anointed, wrapped, entombed beside food and scrolls, enough to survive a journey no one had ever returned from. And still, he couldn't help but wonder, what if the tomb wasn't a gateway? What if it was just a box? Every year, he'd visit the construction, inspect the progress, smile for the priests. They'd praise the murals, comment on the alignment of stars. And every time, he'd feel a chill, because the walls weren't just for art. They were his legacy in stone, and each figure drawn was another reminder that the world was already imagining him gone. He began dreaming of the tomb, long, echoing corridors, no exit, no sky. He'd wake gasping, wrapped in linen sheets, wondering if he'd been buried alive. In myth, people said tombs preserved the body, but he feared they preserved the lie that he had ruled, that he had been joyful, that he had chosen any of it. He asked a priest once, "What if I die before it's finished?" The man bowed, unfazed. "Another chamber will be carved, another plan drawn. The gods will not be surprised." It was meant as comfort, but it chilled him, because it meant he was replaceable, even in death, even eternity had contingency plans. There were traps built in, false doors, cursed inscriptions, rooms designed to mislead thieves. They called it protection, but it felt like fear, a fear so deep it stretched beyond life. He wasn't just burying treasure, he was burying insecurity, a fortress for a body that would never know if it was safe. In the final design, his image appeared over 100 times, always smiling, always serene. He stared at one sketch, his own face looking back from eternity, and he whispered, "What if I don't want this?" But no one heard. The walls were already being sealed. The myth was being carved, and the boy who had once asked questions was already being buried in gold. They spoke of the afterlife like it was real estate, not a mystery, a destination with blueprints. There was a map, there were rules, there were fees. The Book of the Dead wasn't scripture, it was marketing, a guidebook for the elite, telling you how to navigate eternity, as long as you could afford the pages. He didn't doubt the afterlife, but he doubted who had the key. He'd seen peasants buried in sand, no scrolls, no chants, just a name whispered, before silence took over. And yet, he was told, those people wouldn't reach the field of reeds, not enough rituals, not enough wealth. It didn't sit right. If gods only welcomed the rich, what kind of paradise was waiting? The palace sold the afterlife. In layers of linen and gold, each charm bought was a promise. Each spell paid for was an insurance policy. He owned hundreds, most chosen by priests. Most he'd never read. They said they'd guard his heart, his voice, his name. But sometimes he wondered, if you needed that much protection in death, was it really peace? Every wall in his tomb told the same story, a heroic journey, demons defeated, a heart weighed and found pure. It was beautiful and fake, a performance extended into eternity. There was no room for doubt, for sin, for failure, only perfection, polished in pigment, because even the afterlife had an image to maintain. Priests rehearsed his death. Long before he died, chants written, offerings scheduled, mourners selected, every detail accounted for. He asked once, "What happens if I'm forgotten?" They answered, "You won't be." But the answer was too quick, too rehearsed. He knew then. Immortality wasn't granted. It was bought, branded, and broadcasted. Merchants sold amulets shaped like eyes and scarabs. Ordinary people carried them, hoping for a fraction of divine protection. The same symbols decorated his future coffin, mass-produced, highly symbolic, and strangely impersonal. He realized he wasn't becoming immortal. He was becoming merchandise, a brand to believe in, a figurehead for other people's comfort. Even the gods had tiers, Ra above all, Osiris for kings, Anubis for transitions. He was expected to join their ranks, not in humility, in image. Statues would show him among them. Paintings would place him beside them. But he didn't feel divine. He felt like a placeholder, a logo slapped onto eternity. The more he learned, the less he believed. Not in the gods, in the system. He saw how it was built, how it was sold, how his face would become part of the next priest's argument for another temple, another tax, another war. The afterlife wasn't a hope. It was a product, and he was its package. Still, he played his part, approved more texts, posed for more art. Because what else could he do? The myth was stronger than the man, and the afterlife had already begun swallowing him while he was still alive, not with death, but with expectation. He stared at the ceiling of his tomb and finally understood. He wasn't preparing to live forever. He was preparing to be sold. There came a point when the gods stopped answering. No signs, no dreams, no whispers in the smoke. The priests still performed. The statues still stood. But the silence behind the rituals grew louder. At first he blamed himself. Then he blamed the stars. But eventually he realized what no one would say. Sometimes the gods didn't leave. They just stopped speaking. The court didn't notice. They kept interpreting omens, inventing visions, spinning silence into sermons. But he felt the absence, in his prayers, in his reflection, in the stillness that followed every question. He asked the high priest directly once, "Why have they gone quiet?" The priest smiled. "They trust you now." But trust, he knew, didn't feel like being alone in the dark. He began testing them, skipping ceremonies, praying at odd hours, saying nothing at all. The heavens didn't crack, the temples didn't tremble. No curses, no plagues, just silence, a blank sky, and a growing doubt. He dared not voice, because if he said it aloud, if he admitted the gods were silent, he might be blamed for their quiet. He turned to old stories. Pharaohs who'd heard divine laughter, who saw gods in dreams, who touched the stars with their thoughts. But maybe those stories were just stories. Maybe the gods never spoke. Maybe people just needed them to. And what terrified him most was the possibility that no one else believed either. but everyone was too afraid to go first. The temple grew louder as his belief faded. More incense, more chants, more noise to fill the silence. They shouted prayers, like they were trying to wake someone. But the gods, if they ever had been listening, had gone somewhere he couldn't reach. Not as a king, not as a son, not even as a believer. He tried to feel them again. In music, in sand, in still water at dawn. He tried to remember what it felt like, to believe without proof. But everything had become theater, every ritual rehearsed, every blessing calculated. Even silence was part of the performance. And he didn't know if there was any part of him left. That wasn't acting. The priests began offering explanations. Perhaps he was being tested. Perhaps a prophecy was unfolding. Perhaps he needed to fast, to pray harder, to bleed. He nodded. He complied. But inside, he was already gone. Not from faith, from certainty. Because once you realize the gods might just be echoes of need, you can't pretend. The silence is sacred anymore. He stopped asking questions. What was the point? There were no answers, just rituals that spun in circles. He still stood in temples, still recited the lines, but he no longer listened for replies. He had accepted the truth. If the gods were gone, they had left long before him. And if they were ever real, they had learned how to survive without being heard. The people still prayed, still brought offerings, still believed, and so he let them. Because belief, even if hollow, was better than despair. He didn't tell them the truth, that the gods had gone quiet, that their king no longer heard anything at all. Instead, he stood beneath the sun, smiling as always, and gave them what they needed, the illusion that someone was still listening. He was still alive. When they began to change his story, new murals appeared in temples. He hadn't commissioned. He was depicted leading battles. He never fought, speaking wisdom. He'd never said. And when he asked why, the artists simply bowed and replied, "We honor your legacy." It wasn't legacy. It was fiction. But the brush didn't care. Only the message did. They painted him taller, straighter, with broader shoulders and calmer eyes. His wrinkles vanished in limestone, his doubts erased in ink. Even his smile, slightly crooked in truth, became symmetrical, perfect, unreal. It was strange, watching yourself become a version of someone else, especially while your real face still aged in the mirror. Scribes altered records to fit a cleaner narrative. Failures became strategic retreats. Famines were divine tests, moments of hesitation, rewritten as divine patience. Even his mother, once a controversial figure, was now described as the womb of the golden dawn. He read it all silently, wondering if history ever told the truth, or only what people wished had happened. He thought of the next king, who would read these stories and believe them, who'd look to his victories as models to follow, who'd stand in his shadow and think it was sunlight. It made him want to scream, to scratch the walls and scrawl the truth in dust, but that wouldn't last. Ink did, stone did, and lies carved deep were stronger than truth whispered once. Priests began quoting him, words he never said, philosophies he didn't believe. He heard his own name, used to justify taxes, rituals, wars, and each time he felt a little less real, because when your voice becomes everyone else's tool, you stop recognizing it as yours. He considered speaking up, declaring the truth, but he knew what that would mean. It would unravel everything, not just the stories, but the belief built around them. People didn't want his truth. They wanted their idea of him. The myth comforted them. The man confused them. So he stayed silent, let them sculpt, their version of a god. At night, he walked among statues of himself, dozens, all different, one smiling, one solemn, one holding a scroll. He never read, each one, more flattering than the last. None of them accurate. He touched one face, chiseled in marble, then touched his own, and whispered, "He looks like someone I used to know." Children recited hymns about him, about how he tamed the wind, calmed floods, spoke with the stars. He watched from a window. As their voices echoed, it should have been fulfilling. It wasn't, because he knew. Those children weren't praising him. They were praising a story, and the real man, the one who feared sleep, who doubted gods, who longed for silence, wasn't in the song. Legacy, he realized, wasn't something you left behind. It was something taken from you and molded into whatever shape the future needed. He would die 100 times, once in flesh, and again each time. Someone reshaped his name. Still, he stood there, watched the chisel, heard the lies, and said nothing. Because the final truth was this: you don't get to write your ending. You just get to watch it unfold. He knew it was coming, not from omens, not from priests, but from within. A quiet tightening in the chest, a silence deeper than sleep. His body began to falter. Small tremors, lost appetite, the chill that lingered in heat. And yet, he told no one. Not because he feared death, but because for once, he wanted something that belonged only to him. They would call it a transition, a sacred crossing. But to him, it was simply ending. Not a staircase to the stars, not a feast with ancestors, just a closing curtain on a play too long. He watched them prepare, the final rituals, the oils, the linens, the spells, and thought, so much fuss. For a moment, that didn't even ask for permission. He stayed in his chamber, didn't summon scribes, didn't dictate final thoughts. He had nothing more to say. His words had been stolen, rewritten, bent into shapes he never chose, so he let them write without him. Let them imagine his final hours, filled with grace. Let them lie, because this ending, at last, was not theirs to control. He thought about his father, how he died surrounded by noise, priests chanting, servants weeping, the weight of ritual crushing breath. He didn't want that. He wanted quiet. So he dismissed the attendants, said he needed solitude, to speak with the gods. They believed him. They always did. It was his last lie, and his most honest one. The room dimmed, light filtered through gold-slicked windows. He lay back, wrapped in linen not yet sacred. No final speech, no dramatic breath. Just the slowing of the heart, the exhale that didn't return. And in that stillness, for the first time in his life, no one was watching, no eyes, no scribes, no expectations. Only silence, real and his. They found him hours later, posed just as they'd want, peaceful, composed, as if death had kissed his brow. They wept on cue, praised his strength, spoke of visions. No one mentioned the loneliness. No one said he died without a single soul present, because that truth was too sharp for the polished myth they had already begun to write. His body was paraded, washed in sacred water, anointed with oils. That meant nothing to him now. They sang songs he didn't choose, spoke blessings he'd stopped believing in. He was carried like a god, but no god had felt as human as he had in that final moment, when no one was there to tell him who to be. The tomb was ready. They placed him beneath stars, painted by strangers, surrounded by treasures he'd never touched, scrolls he never read. They called it a home for his soul, but to him it had always felt like storage, a vault of illusions for a man who had never been allowed to be real. And still, there was one victory, one private truth. They could gild his body, carve his name, write hymns in every tongue. But they would never know what his last thought had been. Never hear the silence he claimed, because in a life stolen by ceremony, he had taken one moment back for himself, and that moment was death. The moment he died, he became someone else. Not a man, not a body, but a symbol. The myth machine spun fast, scrolls copied, murals painted, priests declaring omens fulfilled. They spoke of light leaving the world, of gods mourning his return, but none of them had known him. Not really. They only knew the idea of him, and that idea was all they needed. The scribes got to work. Chronicles revised, errors edited, mistakes omitted. A golden narrative pressed into clay. He was remembered as flawless, merciful, victorious. They recited his victories with pride, never noting they had been exaggerated or entirely imagined. It wasn't deceit. It was tradition. To them, truth was less important than legacy. His wives wept for the crowd. His sons bowed for the court. Even grief became a performance. The people watched with awe, so convinced they had lost a divine ruler. But what they mourned was never the man. It was the mask, the illusion sculpted over decades, and now that illusion would outlive them all. The statues were doubled, temples expanded, his likeness spread across cities, but none of them captured the one thing he'd truly felt, the weight of not belonging to himself. From birth, his body had been public, his choices scripted, his breath measured, and now, even in death, he was still being used to sell divinity. They spoke his name in rituals, carved it into obelisks, believed it would make him eternal. But eternity, he had realized, was a trap, an endless replay of a life he had barely lived. He wasn't immortal. He was recycled again and again, used to keep others, believing in a system. That had quietly consumed him. Even the gods seemed quieter now. No new signs, no fresh visions, only the echo of what he once represented. He was proof that the world still worked, that kings were chosen, that rituals mattered, so they kept his story alive, not to honor him, but to reassure themselves that nothing had changed. Children learned his name. Before they learned their own, they drew him beside the gods. They asked their teachers, "Did he really tame the Nile?" And the teachers smiled. "Yes, child, of course." Because the truth was too complicated, too ordinary. No one wanted to hear. He had been tired, that he had questioned everything, that he had once wished to run. Even in modern memory, they'd call him a legend, a builder, a bridge to heaven. His story would live on, in books, in museums, in whispers, but the man himself, his thoughts, his fears, his quiet rebellion, would be lost, because symbols aren't allowed to be human, only useful. And so, his final truth remained hidden, not in tombs, not in scrolls, but in the silence. He claimed at the end, for all their efforts, they never owned that moment, the moment he stopped being a symbol and became just a man. And if anyone ever finds it, buried deep beneath the gold, they'll know. He was never theirs. He was never even his. And so ends the story behind the mask. The titles, the treasures, the myths. They never told you the truth. That behind every god-king was a boy handed a script, a man trapped in ceremony, a legacy he never chose. If you made it this far, you now carry something they tried to bury. A memory not of gold, but of silence. Thank you for listening, for staying, for questioning. Because in the end, history doesn't remember the human parts. But maybe tonight, you will.